looking at what Jesus had to say about retaliation. Yesterday we covered divorce and oaths. Today, Matthew 5:38 to 42, we're looking at retaliation. And at this point, because of the pace at which we need to go, we're not necessarily going to fill in everything in the outline. If you want a word that goes in there, that's fine. You'll be responsible for any words per se, but you'll be responsible for the ideas that are there. So we want to make sure we get that. All right, so first of all, the principle according to the Pharisees is based on the oral tradition of the scribes and Pharisees, so that Jesus begins verse 38 by saying, "You have heard it was said." And again, not you've heard what was written, because this is not based on Old Testament law. It is based on what the Pharisees are saying about the law, with how they're interpreting it. And the principle stated is this: an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Now, how many of you have heard that expression before? An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. All right, what has been the context in which you've heard that, or what was your impression about that when somebody said an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth? Was it in a positive way or a negative way? Kind of negative, right? Say, oh, that's really vengeful, right? An eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. That does come from the Old Testament law. But the Pharisees were misusing that. In the same way that we probably automatically think today, oh, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And the idea is if you poke out somebody's eye, you get your eye poked out. If you knock somebody's tooth out, you get your tooth knocked out. And that sounds bad. In reality, when God gave that as part of the law, it was good. I guess we better wait until we get to that part where Jesus talks about it. But I guess it's the proper time. When God gave that, it was a restriction, not something which goes beyond, like we might think. So in other words, in ancient times, if Griff were to strike John in such a way as to cause him to go blind, John and his family are going to do what to Griff? They're going to kill him. So what God says, no, we're going to limit it to just what he did to him. So in other words, it was preventing people from going beyond what would be true justice. Do you follow what I'm saying? Now, in reality, no one ever actually came over and said, okay, Griff, you blinded him an eye, now we're going to take your eye, and actually go in there and take his eye out. What happened is that they calculated how much that eye was worth. If it was a slave, for example, and a slave became blind in an eye, how much would that reduce his value as a slave if you were selling him? And then Griff would give that amount of money to John to compensate for his eye. So it's the same thing we do today, where if you're injured on somebody's property, they compensate you. Their insurance possibly gives you so much money for that. Or even if you have to take them to court, the court decides that your injury is worth a certain amount of money. Does everyone follow the principle there? And that's all that was saying. It wasn't advocating going out and poking people's eyes out or knocking their teeth out. All right, it was a way to compensate without going overboard. That's the important thing. But the Pharisees had the perspective that they really are looking for vengeance in this. All right, and Jesus is pointing out the principle, and they, for them it was personal revenge. You did something to me, now I'm going to do something to you. Or I'm going to require you to pay me because of what you did to me. And that's what they're looking at. I mean, you think about the kind of society we're in today where people will sue for any little thing. If somebody does something, there's a mistake or there's an accident, the first thing some people think of, I'm going to sue them for all they're worth. I'm going to get lots of money out of this. And that's kind of the attitude the Pharisees had. But Jesus has a different perspective. So we come to the principle according to Jesus, he says, first, his authority, I say to you, that's establishing his authority again. And then the principle is this: do not resist him who is evil. That's the first thing. Do not resist him who is evil. So what's he saying here? He's saying if somebody is doing something to you, you're not to react against them. You're not to respond against them. So you're not to go after people for what they do to you, in other words. Now, in the case of injury to honor, he explains, and the principle explained, first of all, in case of injury to honor, he explains it this way: whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. So we've heard that before, turn the other cheek, right? What does that mean? I remember watching a Western many years ago in which the hero was trying to be a good Christian, and he's in a situation where a bad guy hits him, and so he says, well, God says I have to turn the other cheek, so go ahead, hit me again. And he hit him again, and the guy said, God never said what to do after that. And so he starts pummeling the guy, and the good guy, of course, wins the fight. Is that what he means? No, probably not. But it's significant, exactly the words that Jesus uses here. All right, who would mind getting struck by me? Okay, come on up, Sean. All right, now, just stand right there. If I'm going to hit him with a strike to do damage, being right-handed, as most people are, where am I going to hit him? In the face. Which side?
Right.
Left.
That's his left side, right? Now, Jesus said if someone strikes you on the right cheek, he specifically says right. That means if I'm going to strike him on the right cheek, how am I hitting him? No. Backhanded. Like that. Did you miss that? Do I need to do it again? Did you miss it?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, they missed it, Sean. Now, if you hit somebody with your backhand, are you attempting to injure them? No. No. What are you doing? What is a backhanded? You ever heard of a backhanded remark?
No.
Or, I mean, a backhanded a compliment? You ever heard of that? What's that mean? It hurts physically?
Mentally.
It hurts emotionally, mentally maybe? So if you're hitting somebody with your backhand, you're not hitting them to hurt them physically, you're hitting them to hurt them emotionally. It's a slap in the face. You ever heard of that expression? It's the same thing. You are dishonoring them. You're insulting them. So what Jesus is saying here has nothing to do with getting in a fight, in a brawl. He's dealing with if somebody insults you. All right, so if somebody insults you, if you turn the other cheek, what does that mean? Turn the other side also. What does it mean then if you're turning the other cheek if they insult you? And by the way, among the Jews, that was the most demeaning thing you could do to somebody, was to slap them in the face like that. So what does it mean to turn the other cheek? All right, you insulted me, so do you insult them back?
No.
No. You say, go ahead, hit me again. Now, not from a standpoint, hey, is that all you got? You hit like a girl? No, not like that. But to not retaliate. Because what was the Pharisees' perspective? I'm going to retaliate. I'm going to get revenge on anybody who does anything to me. But Jesus said, no, if somebody insults you, don't retaliate. Allow them to do it. All right, that's example number one. Any questions? So for a Christian, retribution, revenge is unnecessary. Because ultimately we know God's going to take care of it. So if somebody insults you, don't retaliate. All right, the second case is the case of injury to property. He said, if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Now, what's the difference between a shirt and a coat? Well, a shirt would be kind of the undergarment that they wore. The coat would be their, you might call it a cloak, the outer garment, which was more expensive, do you suppose? Would be more. All right, let me ask you this. Jonas, you've got a t-shirt on, and you've got a jacket.
Yeah.
Is that what that is? I guess.
Yes.
All right. Which is more expensive?
Jacket.
The jacket's more expensive. That was for them too. So Jesus is saying, if somebody is suing you and they're demanding to take your shirt, what is your response? He says, give them your more expensive garment also. That's tough. If somebody is moving against you and wants to take something from you, Jesus is saying, give them even the more expensive item. That's the kind of attitude that we are to have toward others. Not of responding in retaliation, but of giving even more, something that's even more costly. The Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 6, 7, and 8, we have no right to hate the... I'm sorry. No, I don't have that verse written down. I'm sorry. I thought I did. There's something else I've got written here. And it's a comment by a commentator by the name of William Hendrickson. He says this: we have no right to hate the person who tries to deprive us of our possessions. Love, even toward him, should fill our hearts and reveal itself in our actions. So if we're loving our enemy, as Jesus has already told us before, then we will respond not in retaliation, but in giving them even more. All right, next is in case of injury to freedom. And by the way, there's a saying that it might be associated with the previous statement by Jesus. We have the expression, the person is so magnanimous toward other people, he's so loving toward other people, he gives them the shirt off his back. You ever heard that? Mm-hmm. Well, it may go back to this or a similar saying, that in other words, he loves other people so much that he would give them his own clothing even, which would be, in that time period, you didn't have a whole bunch of different clothes. For any of you, you could give somebody what you're wearing today, and it wouldn't faze you much at all, because you got so many clothes at home that after a while you wouldn't even miss it. But back in those times, they didn't. They had maybe a couple undergarments and one coat all the time. They wore the same outer garment all the time. Even used it for a blanket at night. All right, the next statement. An injury to freedom. It says, whoever shall force you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Now, why would anybody be forcing anyone to go a mile? Has anybody ever forced you to go a mile? A coach, I know, right? Besides that, well, see, in that time frame, the Roman soldiers were allowed to force any citizens upon whom they came to carry their backpack, so to speak, or what they were carrying. Because remember, a soldier back in those times had to carry everything he needed, including the provision of salt that he had, food, equipment. And so if you're marching a long ways, that might become burdensome. And so the Roman government allowed that any Roman soldier at any time could pick a person and say, all right, you carry my burden for me for 1 mile. Now, what would a Jewish person think about that? Normally, what would any person think, but especially a Jewish person, think about carrying the burden of a Roman soldier for 1 mile? Are your minds as blank as your stares? You have no idea what a person would think about that?
They wouldn't want to do it, but if they were forced to, they would go the mile.
And how would you do it? With what kind of attitude? What? I can hear you. A bad attitude. Grudgingly? How many times have your parents asked you to do a chore and you did it, but you did it grudgingly? Does that happen? Yeah. Don't enjoy doing it, but you'll do it because you have to. Well, that's, of course, how they would view that. And like any of us would. But what does Jesus say? Not only don't do it grudgingly, but offer to go an extra mile. So that'd be like if you're, what's the worst thing your parents ever asked you to do? What is it? What chore do they ask you to do that you just hate doing? Anybody? Is it washing dishes? Sweeping the floor? Taking the trash out? What is it? A lot of you seem to think that there was something you did grudgingly. So I want to know what kind of thing it is.
Cleaning the bathrooms.
Cleaning the bathroom, yeah. That's something my wife gets on me all the time too, because there's one bathroom I use more than she does, and so she's always after me to clean it, and I hate doing it. All right. So what's Jesus saying? Not only do that, but offer to clean the other bathroom. Right? So that's what he's saying in the, if we put it in our present context, because how many of you ever had a Roman soldier come up to you and ask you to carry his burden? Yeah. So it's easy for us to say, well, that doesn't apply to me, right? That was back in those times. But we are to apply the principles. All right. Any questions, comments? All right, verse 42 then, we see the principle summarized. That is this: give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. Now, again, in the context of those times, people did borrow from one another. But every 7 years, all debts were forgiven. So if somebody comes to you in the 6th year and wants to borrow something, how willing are you going to be to lend it, knowing that the next year he doesn't have to pay it back? Probably wouldn't, right? But Jesus said, don't even take that into account. And if somebody wants to borrow something, lend it to them. One of the principles that Larry Burkett, the late Larry Burkett, who taught economic principles, Christian principles for a number of years, said was, if you can't afford to lose it, don't lend it. Because sometimes families get into real difficulties with one another because somebody has borrowed and then didn't give it back, didn't pay it back, and so then there's a family problem. And what he said, if you can't afford to lose it, don't lend it. And that's true for investments too. Jesus said, if somebody asks to borrow something, don't turn away from them. All right, any questions? All right, let's go to the next section here, which is concerning love your enemies. The love your enemies was coming up. It wasn't in the past. This kind of brings everything to a head. Verse 43. Love your enemies. I'm sure this is a passage that you have read or heard before. And once again, the principle according to the Pharisees was that you love your enemy, love your neighbor, and hate your enemy. There was a prime minister of Spain back in the 19th century. His name was Ramon Narvaez, and he was dying. And so a priest was called, and the priest came into him and asked him, does your excellency forgive all your enemies? Because that was kind of confessing a sin before he died. He said, I do not have to forgive my enemies. I've had them all shot. That's one way to deal with it, right? But that's not what Jesus is saying. That's more what the Pharisees were saying. I can love my neighbor and hate my enemy. All right, so that's the principle stated in B. See, the intent of the law, though, they were to love their fellow countrymen, and that certainly is true. And there are a number of verses in the Old Testament. I think I have some verses written down there for you, possibly, of of how you were to treat your fellow countrymen, but also we find God told him in the Old Testament how to treat enemies. Listen to what it says in Exodus 23, 4 and 5. If you come across your enemy's ox or donkey wandering off, be sure to take it back to him. Now that's not the normal thing we would do. We would probably, take it or say, "Aha, I'm glad that guy's donkey's wandering away." God said, "Take it back. If you see the donkey of someone who hates you fallen down under its load, do not leave it there. Be sure you help him with it." And then Leviticus 19:34, he talks about how to treat non-Jews or non-Hebrews, I should say, living in the land. He said, "The alien living with you must be treated as one of your native born. Love him as yourself, for you are alien in Egypt. I am the Lord your God." Proverbs 25:21 says, "If your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he is thirsty, give him water to drink." So these apparently were verses that the Pharisees ignored because they did not follow that at all. So D, the application by the Pharisees. They omitted the idea of loving others as yourself. They felt that self-love was too high to be attainable in relationship to others. I can never love anyone else as much as I love myself. Secondly, the narrowing of neighbor. They limited the loving your neighbor to the person who acted neighborly. Do you have a neighbor that doesn't act neighborly? Usually there's one in every neighborhood at least. The person that's hard to get along with, maybe that's always complaining, maybe the leaves from their tree always fall in your yard, things like that. And that's what they limited it to the people that were kind to them. Only the same people who were nice to them did they think it was important to be nice to. And then thirdly, they eliminated the idea of the stranger or alien. So if a Gentile was around, you didn't have to be kind to them, and certainly not a Roman. Fourth, they personalized God's judgment. So they said that Israelites who deny the law and the prophets are to be killed. If you can kill them, and if you can't do it openly, then you can do it secretly. So they felt like they were the ones to carry out God's judgment on people. And so, number 5, they rationalized hatred. To other Jews, they said, an Israelite who alone sees another Israelite transgressing and admonishes him, if he repents not, is bound to hate him. So they said, if you point out somebody's sin to them and they don't repent, you have a right to hate them. But what does Jesus say? First of all, the authority again of Jesus. But I say to you, the principle stated is love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So you're to love those who are your enemies. Now sometimes it's hard enough to love our friends. But he says to love our enemies. What does it mean to love your enemy? I'll tell you, the greatest example that just comes to my mind is a man who I think was in the either late 16th or early 17th century, who was a follower of Christ, and it was against the law to not to actually be a follower of Christ and not be in the Roman Catholic Church, and so he was being chased by the authorities, and it was in the winter, and as he was running away, he ran across a pond that was frozen over, and he was running, and he'd hear the people chasing him behind him, and one of the guys was ahead of the rest of them, and as that guy was chasing him, that man fell through the ice down into the water. Now, we might think, oh, I'm going to escape now, but that's not what the guy thought. He turned around, went back, and fished the guy out of the water, saved his life. Whereupon he was arrested and eventually executed. But he loved his enemy more than he loved himself. That's the kind of attitude that Jesus requires. All right, we'll continue tomorrow, finishing up loving your enemies, and then see some other things that Jesus will have.